What if the moment Iran feared most, the one that could finally break the regime from within, didn't come from Israel or America, but from its own mountains, from a people it spent decades trying to erase? That moment may already be happening. And while the world was watching missile strikes and diplomatic summits, something quietly historic was unfolding along Iran's western border that most coverage has completely missed. The Kurdish fighters, everyone wrote off as too scattered, too divided, and too outgunned, just opened a second front, against a regime already fighting for survival. And according to multiple reports, the CIA was involved in making it happen. If this is the kind of story you come here for, the real context behind the headlines, the human stakes behind the geopolitics, hit subscribe right now and turn on notifications. Like this video if you want more analysis at this depth. And share it with one person who's been following Iran but hasn't heard this part of the story yet. Because what's unfolding in the mountains of western Iran right now is one of the most significant developments of this entire conflict. Let's build the full picture. To understand why this moment is so historically significant, you need to start with a number, 40 million. That's the approximate size of the Kurdish population, one of the largest ethnic groups on earth without a country of their own. Kurdish people are spread across 4 nations: Iran, Iraq, Turkey, and Syria. They have their own ancient language, their own distinct culture, their own rich identity, and no flag, no seat at the United Nations, no internationally recognized army, and no homeland. In Iran specifically, Kurds make up roughly 10% of the total population. That's millions of people living inside a state that has spent decades treating their very identity as a threat. Kurdish language schools were shut down. Kurdish political parties were declared illegal. Activists were monitored, arrested, and disappeared. Executions in Kurdish provinces became common, disproportionately common compared to the rest of the country, and the world for the most part looked elsewhere. This history didn't begin in 2026. It didn't begin in this century. To understand it, you need to go all the way back to the First World War, when empires were dismantled and new nations were drawn on maps by outside powers. The Kurdish people were promised their own homeland. That promise was written down in formal agreements, and then it was quietly abandoned. Kurdish land was divided among 4 different states, each of which spent the following century doing whatever was necessary to ensure that promise would never be fulfilled. In Turkey, Kurdish identity was aggressively suppressed for generations. In Syria, Kurds were denied citizenship in towns where their families had lived for centuries. In Iraq, Saddam Hussein's regime used chemical weapons against Kurdish villages before eventually losing control of the north, which carved out a fragile but real form of autonomy after the Gulf War. And in Iran, the pattern has been one of the most sustained suppressions of all. A 100-year combination of executions, forced displacement, cultural erasure, and constant surveillance, all designed to ensure that Kurdish nationalism never grew strong enough to seriously threaten the regime's grip on the country's western provinces. Every generation of Iranian Kurds has tried something. In the 1940s, there was a Kurdish republic that lasted less than a year before being crushed by Iranian and Soviet pressure. In the 1980s, following Iran's Islamic Revolution, which briefly raised Kurdish hopes before dashing them brutally, Kurdish parties fought an open war against Khomeini's new government. They lost at devastating cost. Since then, Kurdish resistance has existed in what can only be described as a holding pattern. Alive, organized, disciplined, but never strong enough to seriously threaten a regime that could dedicate whatever resources were necessary to keeping them contained. Then 2026 arrived, and everything changed. When Israel and Iran went to war, the strikes that followed were precise and unprecedented in their scope. Iran's senior military commanders were targeted and killed. Nuclear facilities that the regime had protected above almost everything else were turned into satellite imagery craters. Air defense networks that Iran had spent decades and billions of dollars building were being systematically degraded. The regime that had crushed Kurdish uprisings with overwhelming force for decades suddenly looked like something it had never looked like before. Weak, distracted, stretched thin, fighting for survival on its primary front while its command structure was in chaos and its generals were either dead or in hiding. For Kurdish leaders watching from their bases in the mountains along the Iraq-Iran border, the calculation was not complicated. When your enemy is absorbing devastating strikes on one side and has never been more vulnerable in modern memory, you don't wait for a better moment, because a better moment may never come. Reports emerged that hundreds of Kurdish fighters, organized, equipped, and motivated, crossed from northern Iraq into Iranian territory through mountain passes their fathers and grandfathers had used for the same purpose decades earlier. These weren't random militias or hastily assembled volunteer forces. They came from established organizations with decades of structure and institutional history behind them. The Kurdistan Democratic Party of Iran, the Kurdistan Freedom Party, the Kurdistan Free Life Party, and the Kamala Movement, a socialist organization that has existed since the 1960s. What made this different from any previous Kurdish military action was coordination. For the first time, these groups, which had historically competed with each other, sometimes bitterly, formed a unified coalition under a single banner against a single enemy. Estimates of their combined fighters vary. Some assessments put organized forces at roughly 2,500 based in Iraqi Kurdish territory. Other sources suggest the true number, including reserves and supporters ready to mobilize, is substantially higher. What's confirmed is that a significant portion of these forces crossed the border and began active operations inside Iran. A senior Kurdish source described the decision in terms that were simple but carried the weight of generations. This was, in their words, a major opportunity, one that might never come again. Iran's intelligence ministry didn't stay silent. Officials denied the full extent of what was happening publicly. But the denial itself was revealing. The intelligence ministry confirmed it had targeted what it called separatist positions near the western border, claiming those groups suffered heavy losses during attempted incursions. In other words, Iran wasn't just denying the story. It was actively fighting a second war it hadn't planned for, on a second front it couldn't fully control, at exactly the moment it could least afford to. And then came the detail that transformed this from a regional insurgency story into a global geopolitical one. According to multiple e-reports citing people directly familiar with the situation, the United States was not simply observing from a distance. Intelligence officials confirmed that the CIA had been actively working to arm Kurdish forces with the explicit goal of encouraging a wider uprising against the Iranian regime. This wasn't anonymous speculation. It came from sources speaking to major news organizations about a deliberate, coordinated policy decision. The American government had been in direct discussions with Iranian opposition groups and Kurdish leaders based in Iraq about what kind of military support could be provided and what conditions would be attached to it. Reports indicated the discussions extended further, with promises of extensive air cover to help Kurdish forces hold territory inside Western Iran if they moved. Kurdish leaders were reportedly told clearly that they needed to choose a side, either stand with the United States and Israel against a regime that had spent decades suppressing their identity, or remain aligned with that regime and watch the opportunity of a generation pass. For a population that has waited more than a century for outside powers to back their cause with something more than rhetoric, that message landed with enormous force. Right here, before we get into what happened next, let's do something. If you've been following the Iran war and this is the first time you've heard a clear explanation of the Kurdish dimension, you've just found what you were looking for on this channel. Go to the comments and drop a single word that describes what this story makes you think about. One word. Anything. Those comments matter. They tell the platform this conversation is worth pushing to more people. And if you're not subscribed yet, now is the right moment. The next chapter of this story is moving fast. Let's keep going. Iran's response to the Kurdish incursions was both swift and revealing about the regime's actual level of desperation. Rather than limiting its military response to operations inside its own borders, Iran turned its firepower toward northern Iraq, the Kurdistan region of Iraq, where many of these opposition groups were based. Ballistic missiles and drones began striking Kurdish territory in Iraq, hitting near cities and towns that were at most indirectly connected to the cross-border operations. In under 2 weeks, nearly 200 separate strikes landed on the Kurdistan region of Iraq. This was not a warning. This was Iran attempting to eliminate the threat at its source, regardless of the fact that doing so required attacking inside a sovereign neighboring country. The Kurdistan Regional Government, Iraq's autonomous Kurdish administration, found itself in a position with no good options. Officials called repeatedly for de-escalation. They publicly stated they had no desire to be drawn into a war between Iran and any other party. They tried to maintain neutrality, but when ballistic missiles are striking your territory because armed groups are operating from bases near your cities, neutrality stops being a practical option and becomes simply a position you announce while absorbing the strikes. Kurdish civilians, who had nothing to do with the military operations, found themselves living under threat from Iranian missiles because of geography, because they happened to live in the region that served as a staging area for fighters Iran wanted to destroy. At the same time, Western military involvement expanded in ways that confirmed this had moved far beyond a local insurgency. Air defense systems from the United States, the United Kingdom, France, and Italy were reportedly deployed to help intercept incoming Iranian strikes on the Kurdistan region. Patriot missile batteries, close-in weapon systems, and other advanced interception technology became part of an active multinational defensive operation in OAA real time. Multiple nations were now engaged militarily on different sides of a conflict centered on what had previously been dismissed as a regional ethnic dispute. The human cost was climbing. Confirmed deaths on multiple sides, Peshmerga fighters and local police units in Iraq taking casualties defending territory from Iranian strikes, Kurdish fighters inside Iran killed in clashes with Revolutionary Guard units, civilians caught in the geography of a conflict they hadn't chosen. Then came a moment that crystallized the entire situation in a way that numbers and maps couldn't. While the world's cameras were focused on Tehran for the funeral of Iran's supreme leader, a moment the regime had staged carefully to project unity, stability, and continuity, active fighting was intensifying in the mountain town of Piranshar, in the heart of Iranian Kurdistan. Kurdish fighters were engaged in direct combat with Iranian Revolutionary Guard units in those mountains, while official state ceremonies were being broadcast from the capital. The Democratic Party of Iranian Kurdistan confirmed that 6 of its fighters were killed in one clash. The men were named, honored, and mourned publicly by their communities. Iran's Revolutionary Guard announced its own casualty figures from the same engagement. The specific numbers from each side differed, as they always do when both parties have incentives to shape the narrative. What couldn't be disputed was the underlying reality. Even at the moment, Iran's government was trying to present a unified, composed, face to the world during a sensitive leadership transition. It was simultaneously fighting an active insurgency in its western provinces. Kurdish leaders made a statement after the Piranshar clash that deserves to be taken seriously as a political position and not just a military announcement. They said their struggle for freedom and basic rights did not begin with any recent negotiation and would not end because of one either. They stated plainly that any agreement that ignored Kurdish demands, dismissed the regime's ongoing operations against Kurdish civilians, and failed to address a century of documented repression would never produce real peace. That statement carried specific weight because of something buried in the reports about the U.S.-Iran negotiations. Emerging language in the diplomatic framework suggested Washington would commit to not interfering in Iran's internal affairs going forward. For Kurdish fighters who had accepted weapons, accepted promises of air cover, and had crossed into Iranian territory based on assurances of sustained outside support, language like that reads as a warning sign. It reads like the beginning of a withdrawal. And Kurdish leaders, of all people, have spent their entire collective history learning to read exactly that kind of warning sign. Because this has happened before, multiple times, across multiple generations, in multiple countries. Outside powers have repeatedly encouraged Kurdish uprisings when doing so served a strategic interest, and then stepped back when a different strategic interest took priority, leaving Kurdish fighters holding territory they could no longer defend without the support that had just been quietly removed. The 1975 agreement between Iran and Iraq, which ended U.S. and Israeli support for Kurdish fighters in Iraq almost overnight. The aftermath of the 1991 Gulf War, when Kurdish rebels, who rose up in response to American encouragement, were left exposed when American forces held back. These aren't abstract historical footnotes to Kurdish leaders. They're living institutional memory. They're the framework through which every promise from a major power is now evaluated. This time, Kurdish leaders say, the calculus is different. The regime they're fighting has never been weaker. The window has never been wider. And the fighters moving through those mountain passes are doing so with eyes fully open to the risks. This is calculated, not naive. Kurdish leaders know exactly how this story has ended before. They're betting this time the conditions are different enough that the outcome finally breaks the pattern. Now let's think clearly about what the broader regional implications actually are, because this isn't a conflict that stays inside Iranian Kurdistan regardless of how it resolves. Turkey is watching this with particular alarm. Turkey has its own large Kurdish population and has fought its own long-running conflict with the PKK, Kurdistan Workers' Party, for decades. A successful, empowered Kurdish military movement inside Iran is not an outcome Turkey wants. Ideas don't respect national borders. If Kurdish fighters in Iran demonstrate that they can hold territory, challenge the regime, and attract international support, that demonstration becomes a model and a source of inspiration for Kurdish movements in Turkey itself. Ankara has made this calculation explicitly and consistently throughout its recent foreign policy decisions. It does not want Iran's Kurdish problem to become a regional Kurdish problem. Syria's Kurdish community, which already carved out a semi-autonomous zone during that country's civil war, the region known as Rojava, is watching with a different kind of attention. They've already tasted something resembling self-governance. They want to know whether Iranian Kurds are on the verge of achieving something similar, or whether this is another moment that ends in suppression and retreat. Iraq's own government, distinct from the Kurdistan regional government, faces a complicated position as Iranian missiles strike Iraqi territory, Iranian proxies exert pressure within Iraqi political structures, and American forces support Kurdish defensive operations simultaneously on the same Iraqi soil. Every government in the region with a Kurdish population inside its borders has a direct stake in how this resolves. And every major power with strategic interests in the region is making its own calculation about which outcome serves those interests better. stability through Iran's continued control of its provinces, or instability through a weakening of the regime that has been the primary source of regional disruption for decades. These calculations don't align, and the Kurdish people caught between them understand clearly that they will ultimately have to fight for whatever outcome they want, because no outside power will fight the battle for them. So, where does this actually go? Looking at the realistic paths forward with honest eyes, there are three distinct possibilities. The first is that Iran succeeds in suppressing this uprising the way it suppressed every previous one. Iran still has massive military advantages in absolute terms: more soldiers, more equipment, more resources, complete control of its own airspace for domestic operations. If outside support fades, and if the diplomatic calculus in Washington shifts toward prioritizing a stable relationship with Iran over continuing support for Kurdish operations, the fighters in those mountains face the prospect of being isolated, gradually cut off from resupply, and worn down by a regime that has done this before and knows how. History suggests this outcome is possible. The weight of previous Kurdish uprisings all ended this way when outside support withdrew. The second path is that the combined pressures on Iran, the military damage from the Israel conflict, the economic destruction from years of compounding sanctions, the political instability of a leadership transition after the death of the supreme leader, nationwide protests that were already active before the Kurdish operations intensified, and now an active insurgency along the western border, reach a tipping point the regime can no longer manage simultaneously. Iran has survived previous crises that appeared existential, but previous crises didn't combine all these elements at the same time. A regime handling a leadership succession while rebuilding from a devastating military conflict, while managing economic collapse, while suppressing nationwide protests, while fighting a border insurgency backed by outside intelligence, is a regime being tested in ways no modern Iranian government has faced. The question is whether any of these pressure points produces a crack the others can widen, or whether the regime's capacity for internal repression and external maneuvering keeps the whole structure standing. The third path, and honestly the most likely one based on how similar conflicts have resolved throughout modern history, is the grinding middle. No clean Kurdish victory, no total Iranian suppression. Instead, a prolonged low-intensity conflict settling into the mountains for years, periodic clashes, occasional strikes, Kurdish fighters entrenched in terrain they know better than any army sent against them. Iranian forces unable to fully dislodge them, but also unable to ignore them. Outside powers cycling in and out of active support, depending on what their own strategic situation requires in any given month. This is the outcome that most resembles what actually happened in every comparable situation in the modern history of this region. What makes the situation different from any previous version isn't just the geopolitical stakes, it's the human reality underneath it. The families in villages near Piranshar who hear explosions in the mountains and don't know whether it's Kurdish fighters, a Revolutionary Guard patrol, or an airstrike aimed at neither of them. The shopkeeper who boards up windows, not because he supports either side, but because glass doesn't negotiate with military conflict. The teenager watching cousins leave for the mountains, calculating silently whether he'll make the same choice next year or the year after that, or never. The mother listening to news reports that describe the ambush where her son was last known to be operating, waiting for information that may not come. Multiply that family across hundreds of towns scattered through Iranian Kurdistan, and the scale of what this actually means for ordinary human lives becomes clear. It's not missile counts and battle reports. It's an entire population living in suspension, waiting to find out whether the moment their grandparents dreamed about is finally arriving, or whether history is preparing another version of the betrayal they've absorbed so many times before. This is also a reminder of how the biggest turning points in history look while they're actually happening. They rarely announce themselves clearly. They look like border incidents, mountain skirmishes, intelligence reports from unfamiliar places, footnotes in newspapers focused on something bigger and more visible happening elsewhere. It's only later, sometimes years later, that people look back and recognize the moment when a pattern that had held for a century finally began to break. Whether this is that moment for the Kurdish people is genuinely not yet decided. The fighters moving through those mountain passes know it might not be. They've read the history. They understand the pattern. They've seen what happens when outside powers decide their strategic convenience is more important than a promise made to people who don't have a state to protect them. They're going anyway, because the window is open, because the regime is weakened in ways it has never been before, because 40 million people without a homeland have been waiting for a window like this for more than 100 years, and because staying in the mountains, waiting for a better moment while this one passes, is a choice with its own consequences. The consequence of watching history happen to you rather than through you. Whatever comes next in those mountains, whether this fades into another suppressed uprising or becomes the opening chapter of something that rewrites the map of the Middle East, one thing is already true. Thousands of Kurdish fighters looked at the chaos surrounding Iran's worst military crisis in decades and decided the moment had come. That decision alone has already changed what's possible in this region. Whether it changes what's permanent is the question history is still answering. If this gave you a clear picture of something that the regular coverage has been burying in the back pages, do one thing before you leave. Don't just like it, though please do. Send this video to someone specific, someone who's been following this conflict and doesn't yet understand the Kurdish dimension of it. One deliberate share puts this analysis in front of someone who needs it and keeps this channel doing the work it's built to do. Share it, stay subscribed, and I'll see you when the next chapter of this story breaks.